At noon on August 15, 1945, the Empire of Japan fell silent. Factories stopped, trains halted mid-journey, teachers paused mid-sentence. Every home from the cities, still smoking, to the remote mountain villages, turned toward a single sound: the Emperor's voice. It was the first time the people of Japan had ever heard it. Until that moment, he had been an image, a figure seen only in portraits, never a man with breath and trembling tone. But when the broadcast began, and his words echoed through the static, something deeper than sound passed through the nation. Those who listened would later say they couldn't understand the words. The old, courtly language was too distant, but they understood the voice. It was not the voice of victory, nor of command. It was the voice of a man who had carried the unbearable, the voice of a god brought down to earth shaking. In that trembling came truth. The war was over, the empire had surrendered, and in that moment, a nation's heart broke not in anger, but in silence. Today, historians call it the dual voice broadcast. But to those who heard it, it was something else entirely, a sound that made the strongest men weep, a moment when even the cicadas seemed to stop singing, and a whisper that told 80 million souls that everything they knew had ended. This is the story of that voice, how it was saved from those who tried to silence it, how it carried through every wooden house and factory, and how, for the first time in history, Japan heard its emperor cry. The morning of August 15th, 1945, began like any other, humid, heavy, the smell of late summer drifting through open windows. But by noon, Japan would never sound the same again. At 10 o'clock, an announcement went out. All citizens, please stand by for a special address from His Majesty the Emperor at noon. No one knew what it meant. Even the station workers at NHK, Japan's national broadcaster, spoke in whispers. They were told only two things: play the national anthem first. Then, when the record ends, begin the broadcast marked Imperial Rescript on the termination of the war. The words felt strange in their mouths. Termination of the war. No one dared say surrender. Not yet. Across Tokyo, people gathered around radios, small wooden boxes humming with static. Families placed them on the floor, as if before an altar. Neighbors crowded together, children shushed by trembling hands. Factories stopped their machines. Farmers put down their tools. Even soldiers, those still manning checkpoints or guarding train stations, turned their heads toward the nearest loudspeaker. At 11:55, the broadcast began with a crackle. Then came the first notes of Kimigayo, the national anthem. The melody was solemn, drawn out, filled with the echo of 1,000 ceremonies, and marches now turned to ghosts. In some homes, old men stood and bowed, others knelt. Many simply froze, their hearts beating louder than the song itself. When the anthem ended, there was no applause, no transition, just silence. The silence of an entire country holding its breath. At exactly 12 o'clock, a faint click signaled the start of the record, and then the voice. Soft, distant, almost swallowed by static. A voice that had never been heard by the people it ruled. It began with the words, "To our good and loyal subjects." A few listeners gasped. Some bowed instinctively, others covered their mouths in awe. For generations, the emperor had been seen, not heard, a divine figure beyond sound. But now, through the hum of radio waves, his voice was fragile, human, and trembling. A farmer in Niigata later wrote in his diary, "It was like hearing thunder from inside a temple, something holy yet breaking." He spoke slowly, in the ancient court language known as bungo, formal and distant. Many could not follow the meaning, but they understood the tone. They heard pain, they heard surrender hidden between the syllables. And they heard something else, the weight of a man forced to break his own silence to end his nation's suffering. One child whispered to her mother, Why does the emperor sound sad? Her mother only lowered her head. When he paused, the world seemed to stop with him. Outside, no dogs barked, no carts moved. Even the cicadas quieted, as if nature itself listened. It wasn't just a broadcast. It was a moment of transformation, from empire to ashes, from obedience to grief, from unbroken silence to the sound of a god made human. And yet, as his voice trembled on, many still did not fully understand what he was saying. Not until later, when the words were printed, would they realize the truth, that in those measured phrases, their emperor was telling them the war was lost. But for now, they just listened. And when his voice cracked, so did the hearts of 80 million people. If you've ever heard a recording of the dual voice broadcast, pause and imagine it not through speakers, but through the static of war. What would you have felt hearing your leader's voice for the first time? The recording that shook a nation had never been heard at all. Hours before it played, it sat hidden inside the imperial palace, pressed into two fragile phonograph records labeled Gyokuan Hoso, meaning dual voice broadcast. They were ordinary discs, only 15 inches wide, but within their grooves lay the fate of an empire. The recording had been made 2 days earlier, in the quiet hours of the night. A microphone was placed before Emperor Hirohito, a man who had spent his life speaking to generals, not to the public. He stood straight, hands trembling slightly as the engineers adjusted the equipment. His first attempt was unusable. He spoke too softly. The technicians bowed, apologizing, asking if he might try again. He nodded. And so, on August 14th, inside a small room scented with incense and sweat, he recorded it once more. He read from a parchment scroll in Bungo, the formal Japanese used in poetry, and imperial decrees, the same language his ancestors had spoken centuries before. To the modern ear, it sounded distant, ceremonial, almost foreign. Yet those few in the room could feel something the microphones couldn't capture, his voice shaking, his breath breaking as he reached the words, "We have resolved to pave the way for a grand peace by enduring the unendurable." It was the moment the emperor himself accepted defeat, and when the record stopped spinning, no one spoke. The silence in that small chamber was heavier than the war itself. Outside, however, danger was moving. A group of radical officers, furious at the decision to surrender, plotted to seize the palace and destroy the recording before it could be broadcast. If they succeeded, Japan might fight on, perhaps for months, perhaps to extinction. That night, soldiers loyal to the emperor hid the 2 discs in a box labeled Gagaku Instruments Court Music and smuggled them to the palace basement. When the rebels arrived, demanding to know where the voice of surrender was kept, they found nothing but empty corridors and confusion. One officer later recalled, "We heard rumors the emperor had spoken into a machine. We did not believe it until we heard it with our own ears the next day." And so, against every risk, the recording survived. The following noon, it would be placed on a turntable inside NHK's broadcasting room. Technicians stood by, pale with fear and reverence. They had been told not to look away, not even to blink. When the needle touched the record, a faint hiss filled the air. Then, the voice thin, distant, almost fragile. The engineers watched as the stylus traced the grooves, each vibration carrying words that would end. 15 years of war. He spoke not of surrender, but of enduring the unendurable. Not of defeat, but of the need to preserve peace for all generations to come. He never said, "We lost." He said, "We must bear the unbearable." For many listeners, it was only after the broadcast ended that they realized what he had meant. The emperor had cried in the only way he was allowed to, through restraint. And in that restraint, his voice cracked not from weakness, but from carrying the weight of a broken nation. A woman in Osaka later remembered, "When His Majesty said those words, I covered my mouth. It felt as if even breathing was a kind of betrayal. The jewel voice trembled, and with it, the idea that the emperor was more than human trembled too. He had spoken. He had surrendered. And in that moment, divinity met grief. Pause and imagine that trembling voice reaching your home through static and dust. What would you have done? Bowed, cried, or simply stood frozen? Tell me in the comments, what would surrender sound like to you? When the broadcast began, Japan became a sea of stillness. In cities flattened by bombs and villages untouched by war, people pressed their ears close to the radio, afraid to miss even a single syllable. But most could barely understand what they heard. The emperor's words were wrapped in ancient language phrases like, "We have ordered our government to communicate and accept the provisions of the joint declaration." No one said surrender, no one said defeat. Only careful, distant words, as if to soften a wound that had already cut too deep. In one wooden home in Nagano Prefecture, a farmer's wife knelt beside a small radio set. Her husband was still missing in the Philippines. She didn't speak the court dialect, but she heard the tone, the tremble, the pauses, the exhaustion between the words. Her hands began to shake. She whispered, "The emperor is crying." The woman's neighbors gathered around her, heads bowed. No one dared move. When the broadcast ended, they still knelt in silence. Then, one by one, they began to weep quietly, privately, as though afraid the gods themselves might hear. Across Japan, the same scene unfolded in 1,000,000 homes. Children clutched their mothers' sleeves, asking, "Mama, what did he say?" And mothers, unsure how to answer, simply held them tighter. In a school classroom in Hiroshima, where the walls still bore the burn marks of the bomb, a group of orphans sat in rows before a borrowed radio. The principal had told them, "You will hear His Majesty speak." When the voice came through, the children bowed, not understanding that the war that had taken their parents was finally over. One girl, 8 years old, wrote in her diary that night, "I did not understand his words, but I felt something warm and sad inside my chest. That was peace." In the cities, people listened through outdoor loudspeakers. Men who had once shouted patriotic slogans stood frozen, hats in hand. Shopkeepers left their tills open. Workers stopped mid-hammer, their tools hanging in the air. A Tokyo journalist later recalled, "There were no cheers, no applause, only the sound of people crying, as if the entire nation were breathing out at once, and in that breath, something immense shifted. The war once shouted from rooftops ended in a whisper. The emperor's trembling tone became the sound of collective mourning. In tatami rooms and shattered apartments, people prayed for the dead, for forgiveness, for meaning. Some offered tea before photographs of lost sons. Others bowed to the floor, whispering thanks that the bombing would finally stop. The silence after his words was the kind that carried weight, a silence that filled streets, mountains, and hearts alike. It was the silence of realization that what had been fought for, sacrificed for, believed in, was gone. And yet, it was also the silence of relief. For the first time in years, no one expected the air raid siren to sound. No one feared the knock at the door. Only the sound of the wind through broken walls and the voice of the emperor echoing in their memories. If this moment moves you, if you can imagine that unbearable silence, share this story, so others remember what it meant when the war finally stopped, not with a bang, but with a voice. When the broadcast ended, the sound did not fade, it deepened. It turned into something vast, wordless, and heavy. From the northern island of Hokkaido to the farthest shores of Kyushu, Japan fell into a single united silence. Factories went still. Workshops, where the hammering of steel had never stopped, fell quiet mid-swing. In classrooms, teachers lowered their chalk. Even the bells in temples seemed to pause before ringing again. It was as if sound itself had bowed. No one had ordered it, no government decree, no military command. It simply happened, a hush that traveled faster than any army, carried by shock, disbelief, and something deeper, a sense that the world they knew had ended. In one fishing village along the coast of Shizuoka, the townspeople gathered on the pier, listening to a radio placed on a wooden crate. When the voice stopped, the old men removed their caps, the women pressed their palms together, and the fishermen turned toward the sea. One said quietly, "The war is finished." Another replied, "Then what do we live for now?" No one answered. In the capital, people wandered through streets still scarred by bombings. Some carried flowers, placing them on the steps of shrines or the ruins of family homes. Others simply stood, staring at the sky, as if waiting for something else to happen, perhaps a plane, perhaps a miracle. But all they heard was the faint crackle of static still echoing from the radios. Reporters later described Tokyo that day as a city without voices, not the silence of peace, but of exhaustion, the kind of silence that comes only after too much noise. In rural Japan, the hush carried differently. Farmers paused in their fields, their straw hats tilted low. Some wept openly, letting their tears fall onto the soil. They had lost sons, brothers, fathers, yet even grief felt restrained, respectful, as though the land itself demanded reverence for what had just been spoken. In Nagasaki, where the ruins still smoldered from the atomic blast, a few survivors huddled around a broken loudspeaker salvaged from a school. They listened in disbelief. The emperor had spoken. Peace had come. But for them, the word peace sounded like something from another world. One survivor later wrote, "When I heard his voice, I cried, not for joy, but because I was still alive." Across the islands, the hush became part of the air. No marching boots, no broadcast propaganda, no patriotic songs, only the distant hum of cicadas returning to the fields. Nature reclaimed what men had destroyed. The empire that once shouted of destiny had ended in quiet. And within that quiet, something sacred began, not triumph, not even forgiveness, but understanding. People did not shout banzai anymore. They whispered prayers. They knelt before small altars, setting out rice and incense, asking ancestors to forgive what had been done in their name. For the first time in years, there was no one to obey, no one to cheer, no one to fear, only the sound of their own breath. And in that stillness between grief and gratitude, Japan began to wake from its long nightmare. While Japan wept in silence, others still reached for their guns. In the deep corridors of the imperial palace, the very heart of the empire, the war was not yet over. The night before the emperor's voice was broadcast, a handful of men had sworn an oath: the surrender must never be heard. They were young officers from the imperial guard, furious, desperate, and convinced that giving up was a betrayal of every soldier who had died. To them, peace was treason. Their leader was Major Kenji Hatanaka, a passionate idealist who believed Japan could still fight one final battle to preserve its honor. He had heard the rumors that the emperor had recorded a message accepting the Allied terms. He refused to believe it. But when he confirmed it was true, something inside him broke. At midnight on August 14th, Hatanaka and his men stormed the palace grounds. Their goal was simple: find the recording and destroy it before dawn. The corridors of the Imperial Household Agency were lit only by candles. Servants and guards froze as the young officers pushed through, demanding to know where the traitors had hidden the record. Outside, rain fell softly, mixing with the sound of boots echoing through marble halls. Inside one small room, Chief Chamberlain Yoshihiro Tokugawa guarded two unmarked boxes, the phonograph discs that held the emperor's surrender message. He knew if they were found, Japan would continue fighting. If they were preserved, millions might live. So, he hid them. He and two loyal servants carried the discs into a secret chamber beneath the palace, disguising them among crates labeled Gagaku instruments, ancient court music. When the rebels burst in moments later, all they found were scrolls and dust. The coup, later known as the Kyujo incident, spiraled into chaos. Some palace guards joined Hatanaka, others resisted. At one point, gunfire echoed in the hallways. A general loyal to the emperor was shot and killed, trying to reason with the conspirators. Outside, Tokyo still slept under curfew. The people had no idea their entire future was delicate, that the surrender they would hear at noon almost vanished before it could reach them. By dawn, the plot was unraveling. Word spread that loyal troops were closing in. When Hatanaka realized the broadcast would go forward, he mounted his constant motorcycle and sped through the city, scattering leaflets, begging soldiers to resist the surrender. Few listened. The war had already taken too much. No one wanted more blood. At 11 a.m., Hatanaka stopped his motorcycle outside NHK headquarters. He drew his pistol and took his own life beneath a grey Tokyo sky. In his pocket, searchers later found a poem he had written moments before. "I have nothing to regret now that the spirit of the military will live on forever." But history would remember something else, that because the recording survived, millions did not die in vain. Inside NHK, the engineers who had guarded the discs placed them carefully on the turntable. As the needle dropped, the first faint hiss filled the air. And 1 hour later, the voice of the emperor, fragile, trembling, resolute, reached every corner of Japan. The coup had failed. The voice had spoken, and the empire that had once ruled Asia by sword and fire now ended with the sound of a man asking his people to endure the unendurable. By sunset, control had been restored. The military swore new loyalty to peace, and in homes still filled with tears, families finally exhaled, not knowing how close the world had come to hearing silence instead of surrender. Decades passed, but that voice, thin, trembling, and wrapped in static, never truly left Japan. Those who heard it carried it like a scar, and those born after it felt its silence in the air they grew up breathing. Every year on August 15th, at exactly noon, radios across the country replay the dual voice broadcast. Even now, old men bow their heads, elderly women close their eyes, and for a brief moment the sound of the emperor's sorrow echoes again across a peaceful nation. For the generation that lived through it, the broadcast is not just history, it is memory. It is the exact second the world they knew collapsed, and something fragile, uncertain, yet beautiful began. One survivor, now in her 90s, said during a televised interview, "It wasn't what he said, it was how he said it." His voice was not that of a god, it was that of a father telling his children he was sorry. For many Japanese, that moment redefined the meaning of authority. The emperor had not commanded, he had confessed, and in that confession, he became human. In schools, teachers still play the recording, explaining how difficult it was to understand, not just because of the words, but because the nation was not ready to hear surrender. Students listen, often frowning at the old formal phrases. Some whisper that he sounds calm, others say he sounds broken. Few realize that what they are hearing is not just speech, it is the weight of history made audible. Historians describe the broadcast as one of the most important moments of the 20th century, the first time an emperor's voice reached his people directly. But for those who lived through it, it was something simpler, the sound of survival. After the war, Japan rebuilt on that silence. From ashes rose factories, schools, cities, a democracy born not from defiance, but from reflection. And though the emperor continued his ceremonial duties, he would never again be seen as divine. The voice that had trembled through the air in 1945 had changed that forever. Even today, some say they can remember the exact smell of the room where they heard it: tatami mats, incense, the faint scent of smoke drifting in from the ruins. The voice played through static, echoing off walls that were cracked but still standing. And when it ended, the world was new. A historian once wrote, "No empire ever fell so quietly." Perhaps that is why it endures, because it did not end in triumph or vengeance, but in humility. It was the sound of one man speaking 12 minutes that changed the course of a nation. A sound that continues to remind Japan that peace began not with power, but with a trembling voice, asking its people to endure and to live. And every year, as the recording plays once more, the same hush returns, the same stillness that spread across the islands that August afternoon. Children stop their games, old radios hum, and somewhere, in every home, someone whispers the words their parents once did: "We heard him. We will never forget." At noon on August 15th, 1945, the sound that ended the Second World War in Japan wasn't the crash of a bomb or the signature on a treaty. It was a voice soft, strained, and trembling with grief. In those 12 minutes, Emperor Hirohito did what no weapon, no general, and no government could. He told a nation of 80 million people that it was time to stop fighting, time to live. The US military had expected riots, uprisings, mass suicides, chaos. None came. Instead, Japan answered its emperor with silence. Not out of fear, not out of blind obedience, but because the voice that spoke to them that day carried a truth everyone already knew: that the war had taken everything worth fighting for. Those who listened would never forget the tremor in his tone, the pauses between words, the way the recording hissed with static, as if even the air itself was breaking. Many did not understand the archaic phrasing, but they understood what their hearts had already accepted: that the empire was gone, and a nation had been brought to its knees not by defeat, but by exhaustion and mercy. In the years that followed, Japan rebuilt slowly, quietly, humbly. The ashes of its cities became the foundations of something new. The radio that once carried the voice of surrender began to carry the sounds of laughter, music, and life. The emperor's voice, once a symbol of divine authority, became something else, a reminder of fragility. It reminded people that even the mightiest voices can crack, that even the most powerful figures can bow, and that sometimes salvation comes not from command, but from confession. Every August 15th, at the moment the clock strikes noon, the nation stops once more. Buses pull over, office workers stand still, shoppers lower their heads, and across the archipelago, from crowded cities to mountain shrines, the same sound echoes: the faint hiss of the dual voice broadcast, replayed through radios, televisions, and speakers. It is a ritual of remembrance, a way of saying, "We still hear you," for in that voice lies the sound of both sorrow and survival. The sound of a country that lost everything and chose against all odds to live. The world remembers wars for their explosions. Japan remembers this one for its silence, because when the emperor cried, an entire nation bowed its head, and when his trembling voice fell quiet, Japan and the world finally understood what peace sounded like.